Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a literal textual cold case that has baffled, divided, and honestly fascinated scholars for millennia. We are looking at the very first recorded acts of worship in human history, the classic story of Cain and Abel. But we aren't just doing a surface-level reading today, oh no. Based on a really fascinating study by author Lisa Basinger, we're going to dig deep into the original Hebrew vocabulary, historical sacrificial patterns, and some ancient rabbinic commentaries. By breaking down these textual clues, we're going to uncover an entirely new dimension to a story you probably thought you already knew front to back.
So here is the central mystery we have to solve today. Why was Cain's offering really rejected? People have debated this for centuries, right? Like, was it because God simply preferred shepherds over farmers? Was Cain's produce rotten? Or was there a very specific technical requirement that Cain actively ignored? We are going to conduct a completely impartial investigation into the historical and linguistic evidence provided by the author to find out exactly what went wrong that day.
Okay, let's start by laying out the basic facts of the narrative. If you look at the standard English translation of Genesis chapter 4, the outcome is pretty black and white. It says, "The Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering." But here's the thing. The English translation gives us the what, but it completely skips over the why. To understand the why, we really need to look closer at what exactly these two brothers brought to the altar.
Okay, let's dive into this and strip the story down to the raw evidence. Cain brought the fruit of the ground. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat. Now on the surface, it just seems like both men are bringing the fruits of their respective labors. Cain's a farmer, so he brings crops. Abel's a shepherd, so he brings sheep. Simple, right? While actually, according to ancient patterns of worship, there is a massive disparity here that goes way beyond just their chosen professions.
The author points out that Cain brought what's known in Hebrew as a mincha, a grain-based gift offering. Now, to be clear, a mincha was perfectly acceptable to express devotion. The issue wasn't that Cain brought grain. The issue was that he brought only grain. See, from the very beginning, the divine pattern required that a gift offering for atonement had to be joined to a blood sacrifice. Abel honored this oldest type of offering, the whole burnt offering for atonement, by bringing the flock. Cain, on the other hand, separated his gift from the atoning blood.
And you might be wondering about the timing of all this, which is actually a massive clue. The text says this happened in the process of time, or in Hebrew, mikes yamim. Our source notes that classical rabbinic commentators, we're talking heavy hitters like Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Ramban, they interpret this specific phrase not just as some random Tuesday, but as the end of a cycle. They view it as an appointed time of worship, basically a proto-festival moment. And well, if it's an appointed time, there are very specific rules.
At these appointed festival times, the pattern, which was later officially formalized in the Torah in books like Leviticus and Numbers, required three distinct things: blood, grain, and wine. A grain offering was quite literally never meant to stand alone. So when we look at this ancient checklist, it proves that Abel perfectly aligned with the divine standard by bringing the required blood. Cain, however, just brought the grain. His offering simply didn't stand the test of what was acceptable according to those ancient standards.
So the stage is set. Cain's offering is rejected because it lacks the blood requirement, and Cain is, understandably, absolutely furious. And this brings us to the most critical piece of evidence in our textual cold case, God's response to Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. We are going to see just how much can get lost in translation, and why examining the specific Hebrew vocabulary completely changes the entire tone of the story. Take a look at the traditional English translation of that verse. God says to Cain, "And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door." Man, it sounds incredibly ominous, doesn't it? It paints this vivid picture of some sort of demonic, shadowy force just waiting to pounce on Cain because he messed up. But, as we'll see, the Hebrew text reveals a remarkably different picture.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the dual meaning of the original Hebrew word. The word translated into English as sin is the Hebrew word hatat, but hatat can equally be translated as sin offering. That is a monumental linguistic clue. God might not be talking about some abstract concept of evil here. He might actually be talking about a physical offering.
Let's look at the rest of the phrase to see how this fits. The English says, lies at the door. The Hebrew words used there are revotes and petak. Revotes means crouches or lies down, and petak means an entrance or doorway. When you put these words together, they physically describe an animal resting at an entrance. It is not a metaphor for temptation, it's a literal description of livestock.
And this leads us to the absolute aha moment of this explainer. I want to slow down for this because it's so cool. When you combine kata'at, a sin offering, with an animal crouching at a doorway, you get the overwhelming consensus of ancient rabbinic tradition. Commentators like Rashi state plainly that God was pointing to a literal sacrificial animal, a lamb that was lying right at the entrance of Cain's sheepfold. Midrash Rabbah pictures this lamb waiting just outside Cain's dwelling, completely prepared and ready to be offered.
So, from a Hebraic perspective, God's words were not a harsh condemnation at all. It actually reads more like this: "If you do well, will you not be accepted? The lamb is waiting, bring it, and your offering will be received." It completely flips the script. God was offering a gracious invitation here. He provided the exact physical means for Cain to make things right, literally placing the solution right at his front door.
But, as we all know, Cain refused. And this refusal shifts our focus to the second half of the verse, where we see how this missing requirement affected the relationship and the power dynamic between the older and younger brother. Because remember, in the ancient world, birthright and authority were absolutely everything.
The Standard English translation says, "Its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." But relationally, it can be read as, "His desire will be toward you and you will rule over him." The author highlights two more crucial Hebrew words here. Teshuka describes deference, and Timshol describes rightful authority or rank. Basically, God was explaining the stakes to Cain. If you obey and bring the required offering, Abel will defer to you, and you will retain your rightful rank as the firstborn. But if you refuse the divine pattern, the entire relational order is going to reverse. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive recurring narrative pattern throughout the rest of the Bible. Because Cain disobeys, he forfeits his birthright. And this exact dynamic repeats over and over again. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over Reuben, Ephraim over Manasseh, and David over his older brothers. Cain's choice sparked this huge biblical motif where obedience determines elevation and disobedience forfeits rank.
Now this brings us to the author's final theological thesis on how this ancient text and its themes of obedience and sacrifice applies to modern faith. Basinger draws a direct line from the sheepfold of Genesis 4 all the way into contemporary worship, emphasizing her view that the underlying principles haven't changed one bit.
To summarize the author's view, Cain's ultimate tragedy was choosing self-defined worship over God-defined worship. He had a choice, right? A lamb was literally at his door. God provided the exact means of atonement, but Cain wanted to do it his way, which the author describes as a form of rebellion. Abel's offering was accepted because it humbly aligned with the divine pattern, while Cain's was rejected because it did not. The timeless message the author draws here is that while God provides the means of approach, individuals must choose to come by his appointed way. Reporting impartially on Basinger's conclusions here, we see this all culminates in a messianic belief for her. She asserts that the pattern of approaching God remains completely unchanged today, believing that the requirement of the lamb at the door is now fulfilled through Yeshua, the Messiah. So in her theological framework, acceptance still flows strictly from obedience and faith in this provided sacrifice, rather than through human invention or self-defined worship. And that brings us to the end of our investigation today. It leaves us with a massive, fascinating question. How much of our understanding is shaped by what gets lost in ancient translations? We took a story that seems so simple in English, a story of rejected vegetables and some spooky monster hiding at a doorway. And through the original Hebrew, we revealed a complex narrative of ancient sacrificial requirements, a literal lamb waiting to be offered, and a gracious God giving a brother a second chance to save his birthright. It really makes you wonder what other mysteries are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right translation to unlock them. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer. We will see you next time.